that it was because of the British women in India that the, wonderful, multicultural, multiracial society of the kind that is described by William Dalrymple in his very brilliant book, White Moguls, which I'm sure a lot of you have read, that this wonderful hybrid world where the two races, we both lived together in harmony, men married Indian women and had children together, and it was a very harmonious multicultural society, that it was only when the women started to come along that they maliciously put an end to this Elysian world. And two things struck me about this. First of all, whenever, women are an easy group to blame. We don't talk back. There are not so many, in the past there are not so many historians we've been joined by a cat, that's interesting. There are not so many, not so many women historians to kind of take up the, to look again at these histories and see, was that really true? And I mean, I'm not saying that this racism and imperialism didn't exist. Of course it did. But my thesis in the book is that it wasn't only the women, and that it was something to do with a general mindset of the British at that particular time. We're talking about the early 19th century, when the world, what had happened for Britons coming to the subcontinent, and the few amounts of women who came during that time. I'm talking about the 17th and 18th centuries. This world started to change, and it was as much to do with the English mindset back in Britain as it was, it wasn't just the women who had these very racist ideas.
Book, and yeah, that's better. So this is from Katie's book, and it depicts how in 1617 three intrepid British women entered the English establishment in Surat, which was just 6 years after being granted trading rights by Emperor Jahangir to Sir Thomas Roe. So you can now start off. Yeah.
I mean, I think this picture, I put it in the book because there are not very many illustrations you can get from the 17th century. And actually, this is an artist's impression of what the factory, so-called factory, nothing was actually made there. It was more like a storeroom. What the factory at Surat might have looked like.
Okay.
And it may have looked like that, who knows, but anyway, it's a nice picture. It was the women who came in the 17th century were incredibly few and far between. And their experience was an experience, they were the most lowly of the people, of the traders ever to come. The British had they were English as they were then. The English had only just started to trade with the Indies, as it was called. And they were the least important and the least successful traders. They had tried to get trading rights from Jahangir, but actually the permanent trading rights took another 100 years before they were actually granted them. So it was all very temporary and very anxiety-producing. And the English didn't allow women to go to India. All the voyages to India were done in East India Company ships, and women were expressly forbidden from going to India. No one wanted them on board. And so two English women kind of bent the rules in 1616 was very, very early. And, the voyage to India was very dangerous.
18 months, if I'm not mistaken?
18 months round trip, so wow. 9 months in a tiny boat about the size of 3 double-decker buses. Very, very small. And 9 months, that's between now and the end of this year, that you will be stuck on board one of these tiny little ships. You will have no room to move. You'd be at the mercy of the weather,
Sounds like the lockdown.
There were very much. I mean, I think now people have a better idea of what it might have been like.
And since we're talking about the journey, the very perilous journey that these women had to undertake, the reason why, as Katie is saying, they were discouraged from undertaking this is because, as this engraving shows, this is titled Madras Landing 1837. And the very short trip from ship to shore was so perilous, and the waves were supposed to be so terrifying. The women, their very first encounter with India was having to be taken off the ships, put on the backs of Madrasi fishermen and carried to shore. And it was such a dangerous short duration. Some of them were injured, some even died while making that little sort of transit trip.
Yes, the surf was so great. In fact, this picture shows pirates. So, so there were many dangers. These pirates were one of them. Yeah. There is another picture that I'm sure we'll come to later on, showing this incredible surf in Madras. And of course, British women were not used to the sight of these fishermen with very few clothes on, and they were terribly shocked by the idea that the only way they could survive getting from the boats through this dangerous surf onto the beach was by being hauled on the back of these fishermen. So they were traumatized before they'd basically even set foot. So the ones who chose to come were, in my view, extremely brave. You know, there was no infrastructure on the subcontinent of any kind at all, especially in the 17th century. There were one or two so-called factories. There were some English merchants who didn't want them to be there. And these first two women who came kind of slipped through the net because they were employed by an Armenian Christian lady from Agra who had been married to an English sea captain, and she'd gone back to England. Her husband had died. She'd remarried another sea captain. She was rather rich, this lady. She had a very good collection of diamonds, so everyone wanted her. She was a good catch from a marriage point of view. She was returning home to Agra, and no woman of any social status would have dreamt of making this trip without companions or without maids to help her. And so these two British women sort of slipped through the net and were able to go to Surat. And they had lots of adventures along the way, including one of them gave birth to a child practically on board the ship, because she'd secretly got married to another merchant. She wasn't supposed to get married or do anything like that. So the merchants in Surat were doubly cross with her. And there's a fantastic correspondence. The East India Company, even in its really early days, when they were the least important, the least successful merchants. The Portuguese were better than they were. The Dutch were better than they were. The French gave them a very good run for their money. So at the beginning, we're used to thinking of the East India Company as this very powerful organization, but at the beginning of its life, it wasn't at all. It took 150 years to become what we think of it today.
Wonderful. Could you also tell us about the very astounding fact that some of the shareholders of the East India Company in the very early days were actually women? So we're looking at a very dynamic bunch of entrepreneurs,
yes,
in fact.
They were. And that was being a historian is a bit like being a detective. You can go into, in my case, the British Library and look up these, your sources. And one of my sources was the account books for the East India Company. And if you trawl through the list of names, I was astonished by how many women had invested their money. In some cases, quite large sums of money. There was one woman before 1616 and about 1614, so not more than a decade really after the East India Company had been founded, who invested £1,000, which was a very large sum of money in those days. And there were many others like her who invested, bought shares in the East India Company.
This is just an example of the pictures in the books that
yes,
are wonderful, because it shows the East India Company as the time goes by and how they sort of start taking on imperial airs.
Yes.
And
So at the beginning, they were the lowliest of the low, and both men and women had more of the experience of being immigrants, really. And then as the East India Company became more powerful, quite a long time later, maybe 100, 150 years later, and started to acquire land. So by backing the right side, when the Mughal Empire started to disintegrate, and there were different factions all arguing over power, the British, getting a bit ahead of ourselves with the photographs, the British backed the right side. They acquired a lot of land in Bengal, and mostly the sort of origin of their great overweening success, their land grabs, and the great corruption that existed with the East India Company was the fact that they were granted, forced the Nizam to give them revenue tax-raising powers over large areas of northeastern India. And so that is at that point that the mindset of the British, and of course the women that went with them, who up till that point there were very few still, began to change, and they began to get these ideas of grandeur. And that little picture you saw before showed an East India Company official, complete with his, retinues of people and so forth.
to get back to the women that you talk about, these wonderfully pioneering women who came out and into this foreign culture, and they were the forebears of the Mem Sahibs. But here in this picture is Flora Annie Steele, who co-authored the hugely influential Complete Indian Housekeeper and Cook. It's a bit like Betty Crocker of those times, but a complete
the Lonely
book.
Planet Guide.
So can you tell us about that?
So Flora Annie Steele, this is whizzing forward until the late 19th century, so quite a long way. She was actually after the Indian uprisings had occurred, so India, the subcontinent, came under the power of the British government rather than the East India Company. And she was, what I tried to find the women who really had a connection with India. And Flora Annie Steele definitely did. She wasn't one of these women who was there, too hot to even pick up her own handkerchief. She did so many different things, but what you're talking about is she wrote a famous book called The Complete Indian Housekeeper and Cook, which was like a manual. I don't know if any of you ever came across a book called Mrs. Beeton. It's a sort of book that my people of my mother's generation in England always had. It was like the manual for young housewives who had just got married and they were starting out, and it told them everything, things to cook, but also how much to tip your servants. It was a complete manual for domestic life. And so this woman wrote a sort of the equivalent of that for British women coming out to India. And of course, there were many, many more of them at this point. Travel was much easier. Gone were the days when you had to go in a tiny little ship the size of a double-decker bus. Steam travel had taken over, and the Suez Canal had opened, so travel was quicker and safer. And there were many more areas of the subcontinent that were, I quote, under British control, and so a lot more women. And so women were coming to India, and they had left probably much more humble homes at home. They had no idea how to cope with life in such a foreign climate. They had no idea how, most of them wouldn't have had any servants at all before, and suddenly they were in these huge households, and they had to. And so she wrote a guide for how to live. But she was also a teacher. She did a wonderful thing. She was actually stationed in the Punjab at one point with her husband, and she collected folk tales and put them in she wrote lots of novels. Most of them are really bad. I've read some of them. But
she lived
collected
here
folk
for
tales.
22 years, I believe.
She lived a long time in India, and India was her life, literally her life, but it was also her passion. She really loved it, as did so many of the women who I write about. they took India as their home.
What was really interesting is this is not just an experience that was English, for the English, by the English. So there is an account in Katie's book, which I found the most interesting. And this was this apparent collaboration in those days, and you can tell us exactly when this was, between a Kashmiri singer by the name of Khanum Jan with an English woman called Sophie Plowden.
Oh, yes.
And who was Sophie Plowden was granted the title of Begum by no less than Emperor Shah Alam II. And of course, Katie will tell us more about this, but this just shows the kind of fusion that was taking place between how West meets East. And it was a fusion that was being owned by the resident classes, I mean the people who lived in India. So it wasn't just women who were coming to make a little island for themselves in the middle of the subcontinent. So tell us about Khanum Jan and Sophie Plowden, of course.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story. This woman, Sophia Plowden, she lived in Lucknow, I believe, in the late 18th century, and she was a musician, as so many British women were. This is one of the things that separated them from Indian women, was the fact that all their accomplishments, things like learning how to play the piano, that was considered what every young lady was supposed to do. Of course, Indian women of any social class, that was not what they did at all. That belonged to a separate class of women, the Nauch ladies, who were the singers and dancers. Anyway, this woman, Sophia Plowden, was a very talented piano player and musician, and she heard the songs and the singing of this great Indian diva called Janam Khan, who was a famous diva, a famous singer, would give these wonderful concerts. And of course these musicians were among the very few Indian women that British women were able to meet. And it was just
they could enter the zanana, and because most of the women were in parda.
Most of the women were in parda. This is just a little kind of aside, really. The thing that British women regretted, that they couldn't make more contact with Indian women than most of the Indian women that they were able to meet were just their servants. Because women, not just Muslim women, but Hindu women, any woman of any kind of social status observed parda. Yeah. And they had no interest in the British women. British women were very rarely invited into the zananas. They would love to have gone, and when they were invited, they are incredibly overexcited and wrote these accounts home because it was so rare.
There is a very funny one that Katie writes about, since she's talking about how rare it was an occasion for a English woman to enter the zanana. So there's a very funny incident in which an English woman gets doused with attar water instead of because it was a sign of welcoming your guests that you sort of let them wash their hands in attar water. And here was an English woman, and because she was the center of curiosity and they probably hadn't seen an English woman before or a foreigner before, so she was doused with the attar water that was supposed to just be sprinkled on her hands.
Yeah. Went all over her dress. It was a great privilege for her, obviously. But I think that sadly, there are no accounts that exist of Indian women's reaction to these British women. But the very first account that I could find of a English woman, I should say, who went into a zanana was very early. It was in 1743, so mid-18th century. And of course, in those days, with the clothes that British women wore, the sort of, like your best clothes, had these enormous hooped skirts, and they wore, these wigs on their heads, so huge, if you can, like these huge wigs on their heads covered in fruit and flowers and sort of strange, ornaments. But most of all, they all wore stays. In fact, one of the pictures you showed earlier shows that, the British men were very quick to adopt sensible clothing in the, like local clothing in the heat. British women never did, partly because they all wore these stays, so corsets, boned corsets underneath their clothes. Can you imagine how hot that must have been in the height of the summer? And I was just trying to imagine what these Indian ladies would have thought of the dress of these British women. I mean, it must have seemed as if they'd just come from Mars or another planet with these strange hooped skirts and all this huge hair on their heads.
So that's the visual that Katie's talking about.
Yes.
One of
and
the many.
strange hats and, you know, this custom of if you didn't wear a wig, you powdered your hair. And of course, British fashions changed all the time. That was another thing I think was very puzzling to the local people, was the fact that all the time their clothes and the size of their dresses, the amount of petticoats they were, everything was changing all the time. But there are very few, if any. I never was able to find any accounts which gave the opposite point of view. But I'm sure they thought British women were very weird indeed.
To kind of look beyond some of these lovely images, there's some very harrowing stories about women volunteering actually to leave their very comfortable lives, very orderly lives, and to come out to the subcontinent. And we have an account, Katie, that you share. It's not really the rose-tinted image of the Mem Sahib. It's about, one of the stories is about the two English nurses who undertook the journey from England. And it's interesting that you write about in your book that these English nurses who were coming to treat patients during the plague had to travel in third-class conditions, while doctors who were making the same journey traveled first class.
Yes.
So tell us about these nurses. It's interesting.
That's a very good point. These women, there was a very bad plague in Bombay at the end of the 19th century. So I forget the exact date. It was in the 1890s. And so the government sent back to Britain to get more medical staff to help out in this very, very serious plague. And so the doctors, the men, were all sent, first class, and these nurses, who were heroic in what they did, were sent steerage under these very bad conditions, and the conditions that they worked under were quite difficult. If you weren't used to the heat, they just had a tiny little house. They did have one servant, but there was these two women. And I found these letters in the archives in the British Library, sort of almost by accident. It's an enormous archive. Every British woman who was in India, after she died, if she had a collection of letters or a diary or a cookery book or whatever it was, it would end up in the archive in the British Library. So it's, you'd have to have 10 lifetimes to read all of it. So it's quite random at times what I would order up. It would just say collection of letters from a nurse in Bombay, and so you'd have to look at them to see what was there. And they were the most touching letters. It was this woman, Hester Dowson, she was called, sending letters home to her family describing her life in Bombay during these plague years. And she had the good fortune to meet another Englishwoman who she was sort of, they had their digs together, this little house they lived in together, almost at the entrance of the hospital in Bombay, called Harriet, I've forgotten her name, Harriet, anyway.
Is she the gold medalist? The gold medalist? The nurse who was the gold medalist from St. Bart's?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Her name was Harriet. Anyway, these two women kind of, they were each other's great support to one another during this harrowing time, looking after these plague victims, and they were terribly sympathetic towards these people who were dying. The doctors, the men, treated the local people quite roughly and quite harshly, and didn't understand. There was a government edict which meant that people were forced to go into hospital if they had the plague, actually really resonating with what we've all been through with COVID, restrictions that none of us liked. And of course, for women in the zenanas, it was unthinkable that they should go into Purdah, into the hospitals. Anyway, these women were these letters are very sympathetic to Indians and what their religious, sensitivities might be, and they were often in conflict with the male doctors. But anyway, in fact, I was reading a bit of it this morning, and it makes me cry every time I read these letters. But they're so moving because Hester Dowson's friend Harriet contracted the plague herself in the end, and there's a whole series of letters about how she nursed her friend herself, and this friend died. In the end, she died of the plague, having gone out there.
And she contracted
nurse.
it because a patient coughed in her eye. So some of that, the infection got to her because the patient coughed and she got it in her eye. So,
yes.
and she passed away, but I believe Hester made a full recovery.
She did. That's the good news. She lived to tell the tale. But, so these stories are very wide. It's always difficult if you lump a group of people together. If you start to pick apart a group of people and you look at the stories of individuals, any kind of prejudice that you might have against that group of people crumbles away to dust, because there are always exceptions, and some people will fit the prejudice that you have against that group, but more often than not, it's not a binary thing. It's not that they were either good or bad. It's that there's a sliding scale of grey. Sometimes quite white, sometimes very black, but mostly it's a sliding scale, and that's what was such a fascinating thing to research these women.
You do, of course. I'm just trying to see if we can just keep going. I would like to talk about, since we're on this subject of talking about how it was not just an endless series of parties and whatever. There was a lot of suffering involved, and women, as you know, in any conflict are always the ones that suffer the most. And Katie's written about 1857 and how women and children were made the target of the sins that had been committed by whoever and for whatever reason. We won't go into the politics of that, but Katie talks about, and there's I'll get to the visual so you can see that also while you talk about it. You described the incident of Bibi Ghar, where in Kanpur during the uprising, when about 124 children and 73 women were brutally massacred, and this was to end up with terrible reprisals to be perpetrated against the Indian population. You talk about this, and then you end mostly around that time. So tell us what made you sort of not go ahead and stop where you stopped.
It seems to me that we all know about the Victorian Memsahibs and the Edwardian Memsahibs. There have been many other books written about them, very good ones. We all know about the fishing fleet, the fleet of women who came to find husbands, which happened from the very earliest days, by the way. Even in the 17th century, people were coming to find husbands.
So that's the one.
So yes, this is a painting kind of deliberately playing on, the worst emotions of the British, and it was a war. This was during the Indian uprisings. It was a war between, the British were getting, in my view, they were getting their comeuppance, frankly, for taking over country that didn't belong to them. And it was a war, so terrible things happened on both sides. But the British were taken by surprise, largely, and they were so sure of themselves that it became as a terrible shock to them when people turned against them. And one of the sort of folk tales that remained in everybody's mind was the massacres in Kanpur, because it was aimed at British, it was women and children who were killed. And I think that had never happened to the British before. Battles, wars happened somewhere else. They happened usually on the continent, and it was, armies fighting against one another, and there were very little, if any, civilian casualties. But this was a war that was happening, sort of on the at street level, if you like. And so a lot of women and children were killed, and a lot of women and children were killed on the other side as well. And so it remained in the British mind for a very long time that this had happened. And of course, the reprisals in Delhi afterwards were every bit as bad. So it's a difficult thing. It was a very difficult thing to write about, and it's a difficult thing to talk about. But war, very bad things happen in war on both sides, unfortunately.
It is what it is. So tell me, Katie, when you did stumble upon these stories, and what compelled you to actually put it down in this book that you have in front of you? And because it seems that Britain seems quite unable to adequately reflect on the foundations of its colonial supremacy. And your book does set out to dispel the stereotypes. And I know it must have seemed at certain points that you were writing against the tide. And what you were writing about, the very word Mem Sahib, it seems to conjure up the absolute worst, that
Yes.
we can, I mean, the only thing one can say is that it must have taken an act of courage to carry on and to put this down in the book. So tell us about that.
Well, I write about women, and I write about women whose stories have been, as I was saying earlier, stories have been either brushed under the carpet or they've been not told well. And my point is not that the Memsahibs were, that there was no racism or imperialism, not that. It's to show that there was another side to the story. And I think when it comes to us having to face up to our colonial past, I think people are very badly informed. And I think people know about the Raj. So Memsahib is something that is connected in most British people's mind. Memsahib is something that belongs to the Raj. And British people are incredibly badly informed about what happened before. Why did the Raj become what it was? And no one really knows about the East India Company. I mean, now we have William Dalrymple's book about the East India Company, The Anarchy, which is a fantastic book, which came out just before mine. But until then, British school children are not taught that in school. They're not taught about the East India Company, and they should be, because everything that happened here began with the East India Company. And so the further back you go, you have to go right the way back to the beginning to be able to understand how you got to the end. And that's what was so fascinating to me. We all knew about the Raj, we all knew about the women in the Raj, but no one knew anything at all about these women who'd come over in the 17th and the 18th centuries, which is when the East India Company was just kicking off, and it was the underdog. So I thought, that was what was so interesting to me, is that this was a time when the British were not powerful. They were the most lowly of the immigrants to go to India. And that, I just think it's very interesting. But you need to see the picture in the round. You need to be able to see the beginnings of something to understand what happened at the end. So that was it's not so much that I was going against the flow as that I was trying to open it out so that people could see the whole picture and see where women belong in that picture. And of course, it changes all the time. The East India Company was 250 years before the uprisings happened, and then another 100 years of the Raj after that. So yeah, it's an opening up. It's an opening up to giving people information so that they can make up their own minds.
And Katie has written a book. I'd like to bring this in because it might have helped you. Traveling with a Circus. So Katie's written a book about her experiences of living and traveling with the circus. So I'm just wondering, I mean, the way that we're talking about these women being carried on the backs of Madrasi fishermen and coming here, and so it must have seemed like they were living in a circus, or they were part of a circus.
I think they were. I think you had to have a certain mindset. You know, the mindset of the women who came in the 17th and 18th centuries would have been very different to the kind of typical memsahib coming in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think perhaps you're right, actually. I hadn't thought of that. You know, my background is a travel. I started my life as a writer writing travel books about Bhutan in the Himalayas and about Mexico. And so the women who came out of a sense of adventure, I think, was something that I kind of responded to naturally. And I did sometimes wonder what if I'd lived in the early 17th century, might that have been me? Might I have been one of these intrepid women who went off on the boat the size of a double-decker bus? You know, one of these women took £100 with her. She took her savings of £100 and invested it in, she wanted to invest it in indigo, and the merchants in the Surat factory said, no, you can't do that. You're just a woman. You can't do that. But if you want, they were terribly patronising. They said, but if you want, you can invest it in cloth. And there is a letter from Sir Thomas Roe, who was the English ambassador to the Jehangir, the Emperor Jehangir, and he's so scathing about this woman. Her name was Mrs. Hudson, and he said, let her be lucky as a calling duck. In other words, not lucky. In other words, he was being ironic. In other words, really unlucky, because the duck was going to be shot. Let her be as lucky as a calling duck, but let her try, this little woman. Anyway, Mrs. Hudson had the last laugh. She invested her £100, which is the equivalent of about £24,000 today. It was a lot of money. And she bought cloth in Agra, where they went. And when she returned to England about 2 or 3 years later, the cost of the freight on her consignment of cloth was £70. So in other words, she made a very large amount of money. And I very much like to think of her because she's kind of bucking the trend, and I think of her not so much as a woman who was going to India because she wanted to, like the East India Company merchants, eventually they just wanted to take the land, they wanted to take the country, they wanted to suck the subcontinent dry from everything it had. But these women were being, they were being entrepreneurs. They had probably families at home. They were just trying to do the best they could in a world that would belong to men, and that was a very patriarchal world. And they had to be doubly good. As a merchant, you'd have to be doubly good as the men merchants in order to make it work. So
very much shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the entrepreneurs, the merchants coming in. They wanted very much to carve out a new future and take what they could and make of what you want of them, because anyone can take what they want away from this. But I think I think it should serve as something of an inspiration. Perhaps somebody in the audience, somebody picking up this book could go back and talk about the women back then who might have been doing the same on the other side, just like the Kashmiri, the Kashmiri singer, because in the book there are these lovely etchings, and she's written in Urdu, or what must have been in Farsi, the collaboration that she had with Sophie Plowden.
This is Sophia Plowden, who we were talking earlier about this famous diva called Janum Khan, who was incredibly famous and had this beautiful voice. And this woman, Sophia Plowden, went to her concerts, and she was able to transcribe the music, maybe something like your Qawwali we were hearing last night, would transcribe the music so it could be in a Western format, so that women women back in their drawing rooms in England could then play this music on the piano. So it was a cultural exchange, but it wasn't an expropriation. It wasn't something that was being taken away. It was something that was being shared. And I think that's quite a female thing. I think women with my apologies to the men in the audience, women are better at, they don't just necessarily want to take things just for themselves. They want to share them out. And that's why she was made a begum. And there is a picture in my book, which I don't know if it came up on the screen, of the firman, is it? The firman that Alam Shah, which declares that this woman became a begum. And I called it up, because it's in the British Library, this beautiful document, covered in gold, and with the imperial seal on it. It's in the British Library, and I called it up, and it was just before lockdown happened. So then I wasn't able to actually see it myself, but I've always intended to go back to the museum and and try and get it, because it struck me as being like an image of what cultural exchange should be between two countries, rather than what it did then become.
Well, it's
the possibilities, the positive possibilities of it. Let's say.
Yeah.
It's in a different section of the book.
It's in the other.
Anyway,
the
it's
other
very beautiful. It's a very beautiful document.
Well, it's wonderful that we have accounts of this West meets East, and the whole collaboration and the different take on the entire experience, the entire English experience, and that we don't have to be trapped within the dialogue, or rather I just find it a little bit of a jolt every time I listen to Shashi Tharoor, or have to, because they put it across so menacingly, as if we have to acknowledge down with the Britannia.
He's right, of course. He is right, but it's not like he's
so
right. But it's not a binary thing. It's not. The British were either absolutely right or absolutely so completely wrong. We were wrong about most things, but I think that there are subtleties of. I don't think we can all be tarred with the same brush, and I think women's experience is always different, isn't it? They had no political power. They were not able. They didn't make the laws. They didn't make the rules. They were just stumbling along, trying to lead their lives and trying to support their families. The women who worked in India. I write a lot about women who were merchants, women who opened shops, who opened millinery shops, who were dressmakers, opened schools, who were nurses, who did positive things, because they had to work. Not every woman could have a husband to look after, or husbands died. People died. So you might come over to marry somebody, and then your husband died. Then what would you do? You had children to support. So they did in India what women do all around the world. They just got on with it. They did the best that they could, and they did as many jobs as they were able to do, and they were pretty good at it a lot of the time. So mine is more of a feminist perspective than a sort of post-colonial perspective, I guess you could say.
Which is absolutely wonderful. Yeah. We're nearing the end of our session, and we have maybe just a few minutes. I know that people here always like to add something or ask something, because it's a part of history that everyone wants to have a say about. So if we have a question there. Is it on? And please, can we have your name and your vocation? I'd like to know.
Yeah. So my name is Amna Umar, and I'm a teacher. First of all, I'd like to thank you. It was a very inspirational talk. Because one thing that I'm taking away from this is that whether it's a woman of the West or the East, we've had our journeys and we've had our struggles. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you.
My question to you would be, first of all, which part of the continent did you travel to when you were writing? Did you come to this? And secondly, do you think that books like these, now I also read Daughters of the Sun by Ira McCarthy, and that was another perspective. Do you think that if you have books like these, this can open up a dialogue regarding sensitizing people? And sorry, just another thing. Or did you also have an ancestor that, that came to this part of the world that, that gave you an insight of what the life was during the colonial times?
Did I have a what?
Did you have an ancestor in your, as in...
ancestor.
The ancestors.
Yeah. Yes, but not ones that I personally knew or whose stories I was really very familiar with. I had the wife of one of my father's cousins had photograph albums showing the typical, the very sort of typical Memsab experience. But no, I sort of wished I did. I wished I did, because then that was something that would connect me, more personally to India. I mean, I didn't travel in India for the research because it was all documents, and the documents that I was able to use are all amazingly, they're all in the British Library. There is an incredibly, it's supposed to be the archive in the British Library for the East India Company, for anything to do with India, is supposed to be 10 miles long. William Dalrymple told me that. I remember feeling slightly faint when he told me, thinking, how am I ever going to make any dent on it? So the travels that I did, which were, I've come to India, to the subcontinent, on and off for my whole life. But the most traveling that I did was actually when I was quite a young woman, more like a kind of backpacker travel. So, which was a wonderful experience, because it was village India, 30 or more years ago, which made a very, very profound impression on me at the time. I loved it.
So we have one more question, and I think that would just be a last, okay, one more, so we'll have one more.
Hi Katie, my name is Amna Ali and I'm a journalist.
Hi.
So I have two short questions for you. Firstly, you've had quite an eclectic writing career.
Yes.
And you've written a variety of books, fiction and non-fiction. So how come what led you to that? Was it sort of the vast research you did on similar topics? And secondly, was there a crossover between your non-fiction work, like Courtesans and Daughters of Britannia, and this work? So is there a crossover of women?
Yeah. Yes, actually there is. I'm glad you asked me that. There actually is, but in fact, really both of them. So Daughters of Britannia was a book about women married to British diplomats, and I was dying to include some India material in that, but because India was part of the empire, we didn't have diplomatic relations with it, so there was nothing I could include. With great sadness, I would love to have included some Indian material or subcontinent material. And then the connection with Courtesans was really the inspiration for this book. That in my Courtesans book, I came across a famous English courtesan, late 18th century, a woman called Charlotte Barry. And Charlotte Barry was one of a pair, that she had a sister. There were two. The Barry sisters were very famous, part of the English demi-monde. So the world of English courtesans who were, lauded and feted and frequented by elite men. These were very expensive women. And women were not supposed to know anything about them at all. They weren't even supposed to know that they existed. They were absolutely in a world of their own. And Charlotte Barry was the kept mistress of a man called William Hickey, who, as you probably know, wrote a very, very famous, very long diary about, rackety sort of, kind of drunken, debauched life of the elite men in London during the late 18th century. And he, William Hickey, came over to Calcutta, and he brought Charlotte Barry with him. And I wasn't able to include this in my courtesan book because it was all about India and I was writing about, England. this story about Charlotte Barry always stayed in my head because it's such an extraordinary story. So this woman got on the boat on the coast of Britain at the beginning, but then they went to Lisbon and picked up a Portuguese ship to take them to Calcutta eventually. And it was curious that why did they take a Portuguese ship and not a British ship? And it's because the British would not have allowed this woman onto the boat because she was a courtesan. She would have been, thrown off. They wouldn't have allowed her passage. So she travelled sort of incognito to Calcutta. And halfway across the Indian Ocean, she transformed herself from being Charlotte Barry, notorious English courtesan, to the impeccably respectable Mrs. Hickey. And when she got off the other end, and this was not unusual, when she got off the other end, it was under the pretense that she was a respectably married woman. No one in London would have ever fallen for that. But of course, in Calcutta, in India at that time, no one was any the wiser. Or if they were, it was probably because they also had a wife who wasn't really their wife. And so I was very fascinated by the story because it shows how women were able to reinvent themselves, and coming to India was a very great opportunity for, first of all, to move up the social scale. So a woman of quite humble background could come to India and she could pretend to be much grander than she was, or she could be somebody who wasn't accepted at all in British society. I mean, not at all. No respectable British woman would have even been in the same room as her. And yet she passed herself off for many years very happily. She was taken into society. There are long descriptions of, how all the different balls she went to, and nobody was any the wiser, or if they were, they weren't going to say anything about it. So India was a great place for women to reinvent themselves and to give themselves a kind of a new lease of life. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
One more question from a gentleman.
I'm just interested in history.
Hello.
A quick question for you, Katie.
Yeah.
Just to try to get a sense of the numbers that, in relation to the total number of people from England that came here, especially in the 17th century, let's say the first half of the 18th century.
Yes.
Could you give us a little bit of an idea of the comparison number of women that came versus
That's
the
a
men
great
at that time?
question. That is a great question. And the answer is, in 1616, there were 2 English women and one, this Armenian Christian lady from Agra. And they were the only ones that I could find any record of until the mid-17th century, when things changed because Britain acquired, or England, I keep saying Britain, England as it was then, acquired its first colony. Charles II married Catherine of Braganza, and Bombay, the archipelago of Bombay, was part of her dowry. And so in order to populate Bombay, as it was then, they literally took out advertisements to get women to go to Bombay. But the numbers were very small. I should think they were probably less than 100, maybe at that time. And then in 1700, so in 1700, there were supposed to be probably about 200 women of European descent in Bengal, and therefore probably in the whole of India. So the numbers were really small. And it's very difficult to find records for them. It doesn't mean that they weren't there. It's just that if there was nothing written down in the East India Company records, you won't find anything. So the numbers were really small. And so that they were hugely outnumbered. That isn't, I'm glad you brought that up, because, for these women, just that experience alone, when you were there were so few of you amongst so many men, would have been a very particular experience.
So just one last question, and just identify yourself with like your name and what you do.
Right, so I am another Amna. I'm Amna Javed. I think that's 3 Amnas in a row. So lovely talk, Katie. The question that I wanted to ask you was, reading through whatever you've written, there's a keen sense of travel involved in it. And, as a woman who's writing, and of course you're traveling all over the world, you're writing about women, let's dive into you as a writer and your identity as an English woman. Does it sort of, reading through and listening to all of these stories of different women spread out in different parts of the world, does it sort of impact your identity as an English woman, or is it like free of that? Because
That's so interesting. Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And I don't think I've ever thought about it. All I can tell you is that when I was in Mexico, so the most sort of intense traveling that I did was this, I spent a year living in Mexico, about 3 months of which I was living with a circus, because the circus was my theme for this travel book I wrote. And I speak Spanish because I grew up in Spain, so I'm a fluent Spanish speaker. So it would have been very hard to have done it without that. But I remember at the time being very happy that I was having to communicate only in Spanish and not in English, because it made me sort of invisible. It meant that no one could tell what family I was from, no one could tell what class I was, no one could tell what my education was. It made me much more anonymous than I would have been if I'd been speaking in a normal way. If I tried to join an English circus, everything about me would have given people a very particular idea about who I was, and it would have been much less. It was just easy just to kind of be me without any cultural baggage or very little. I can't say there was no cultural baggage. Obviously, I was a foreigner. I was a gringa. I was a foreigner. But all those other things about my background, where I came from, who my family were, I couldn't be identified. It made me as anonymous as it was possible to be, and that was great. That, from the point of view of being a writer, that's what I want to get. I don't want to go around telling people about my experiences as an Englishwoman. I want to receive other people's stories, because that's my material. And you could be yourself. You can kind of. It was a very. You could sort of be you could really be yourself without anyone having expectations about you. It was very liberating. I really, really, really liked it. Yeah.
So from
Thank you. It was a great question. Really nice. Yeah.
So from hearing Katie talk about her totally immersive experience in the circus to being completely immersed in your wonderful book, thank you so much for joining us on this concluding day of the 10th edition of the Lahore Literary Festival. And please continue with the rest of the day's sessions. We've worked hard at putting them all together, and we so look forward to having more authors in the coming years. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure. Many thanks.